Hello, my name is Jake Taylor, and welcome to Polysophical. I'm going to go ahead and get right into this As If It Were essay part 2, Integral Consciousness. As always, I'll put the link into the description if you want to read the original essay itself. But this one contains some really interesting points, so I think you're going to like it. And without further ado, let's just go ahead and get into it. This next point is critical to the importance and function of the as if it were relationship and metaphor, that even as people ascend in the conscious development hierarchy as laid out by Ken Wilber, they are still able to engage with the object or idea in question through an as if it were relationship at each stage of the process. In other words, when someone is able to see the as if function of the metaphor and perceive that the thing in question is not a literal fact but instead only as if it were real, the image or concept can still function as if it were real to the point that it is actually real and functional. I feel as though I sound quite circular and esoteric, which is not at all unexpected, since this is kind of an intuition that defines esotericism as a school of thought, an acceptance of paradox, and the multi-level being and reality of things, a metaphorical interpretation of scripture, reading meaning into things, etc. It's not unfounded to think, whoa, this guy sounds like a mystic here. But here is a very brief aside regarding Ken Wilber and his school of integral psychology. Essentially, Ken uses the work of Claire Graves and Jean Gebser and other developmental psychologists to put forward a sort of hierarchical developmental process of consciousness. Individuals and societies pass up and down this hierarchy of consciousness all the time, and I think it is a very relevant hermeneutic to apply to human behavior. I'll talk more about Ken Wilber in the future, but for now, here is a graphic outline of the 9 stages of integral consciousness. For more, read the book Theory of Everything by Ken Wilber. It's not very long and it's quite accessible. Now, let's think of another multi-level, as if it were sort of entity. So as a brief aside, let's go through this chart. And these levels of consciousness build from bottom to up. So first we have the archaic. Infrared is the color given to this. And this is the dawning of self-awareness, survival through instincts. This is sort of the animalistic phase of human life, and very old. Goes back a very, very long time, hundreds of thousands of years. This is the sort of animal world that we come out of as human beings, and then coming up into an indigenous worldview. This is a fundamentally magical worldview. This is a worldview that sees sort of spirits in all things. The whole world is enchanted. And that is able to be transcended into the tribal worldview, where now it's not just individual, river spirits and individual enchanted items and shamans getting in touch with the spiritual world to bring back wisdom to this little community, everyone in their own little community. Now we move into tribal, and it's something a little bit bigger. Now you have your sort of patron deity of the tribe, and this makes me think of the Old Testament in a way, where it's all of these different gods warring against each other in the Old Testament. Now that the Old Testament is in the amber stage, or they're in the ethno-national, nation-centric stage. They're not necessarily in the tribal stage, but I think it's something similar going on in the tribal stage. It's very clannish. It's very, like it says, egocentric, vigilant and aggressive, impulsive and ruthless. It's a lot less mystical than the magenta stage, and sort of brutal in a very natural sense. And then moving up to the amber stage, we have ethnocentric religions, national-centric religions, very much rules and roles. This is definitely Old Testament style. And as you can see, sort of the estimate of when this came online is about 5,000 years ago. So that puts us in sort of Egypt, the kingdoms of Egypt, and then transitioning into our Old Testament with Abraham, etc., moving forward. And this is a very useful role, because it broadens the scope of who is sort of who can be in the crowd. And And this is very important for us human beings because those who are out, we tend to want to go to war with. So broadening the scope of what is considered true, broadening the scope of who can be part of the true group. These are very important things, and these broaden with each step up the hierarchy. And it is a hierarchy, but every level has its own pros and cons. So beyond the amber traditional religious phase, you have modernism and orange. So this is valuing rationality and science, individualism and democracy, capitalism versus and materialism, all these sorts of things. This is Enlightenment values, more or less. And all that comes with that, the Industrial Revolution and the Scientific Revolution being part and parcel of this sort of modern orange interpretation of the world. This is a much more open society compared to the traditional amber, ethnocentric, religious view of the world. Truth is not like, there is no Muslim chemistry and Christian chemistry. There is just chemistry. There is no Hindu physics versus Buddhist physics. There is just physics. And that is a very modernist conception of truth, of knowledge. And we take that for granted, but it is very, very, very useful to have these sort of universally accepted ways of interacting with the physical world. And we need to thank the modernists for bringing this in online for us, even though there are some severe downsides from the what I would call left hemisphere obsessive elements of the modernist point of view, which is that anything that cannot be rationally explained through the scientific method does not exist, and we can throw it out. This is the beginning of the death of God. This is the beginning of the demystification, the unenchantification of the world. But from the moderns, this is then transcended in the postmoderns. You have this insight going from amber into orange, where everybody that's inside my group thinks a certain way. Everybody outside my group, they think a certain way in their own groups. But there are these things that are true above us that are not group dependent. And we, as our group, are better able to access that. Okay, yes. There's some of the racism and things that come along with those earlier modernist thinkers. But it's still like groups competing with groups and sort of a nationalistic identity, but we're able to accept that truth is truth and anybody can access it. So you'll hear that in sort of some conservative pundits, truth is truth. They're sort of bridging between an amber and an orange way of viewing the world. And then this gets blown out by the postmodern view of the world, which is, wait a minute, every group of people and every system of knowledge even is totally convinced that it is right. And they even have rationales to explain why they do what they do and think what they think that makes sense. They might not be completely valid to us with our axioms that we come in as outsiders to view their system, but that does not mean that they are wrong. That does not mean that we are right. In fact, to logically prove wrongness and rightness is really, really hard. So instead of trying to do that, like we've been trying to do that for so long in human history, why don't we just live and let live? Why don't we just let those people have their different way of viewing the world, and not even just let them have it, but to embrace it and rejoice and love it. Love the pluralism. Seek for equality between all groups and rectify injustices. Because the modernists and the Industrial Revolution, the scientific revolution that came with it, left a lot of inequity. There's a lot of money power that rests in the hands of a very few individuals, very select few families of industrialists, financiers, tech moguls, etc. And that money tends to snowball with time. You know, it's the poor get poorer and the rich get richer, and that's just sort of how it works without some sort of reset every once in a while. And so that's why you see a lot of people who, once they transcend into the postmodern pluralist way of viewing the world, they tend towards maybe a left-leaning social politic. and all of the pros and all of the cons that come with that, because ultimately, stages 1 through 6, archaic, indigenous, tribal, traditional, modern, postmodern, there is a unifying problem with all of these stages, which is that each of them is unable to look back at the stages that came before them and admit that they were not totally wrong, and admit that they have truths that need to be brought along with them, in more than just a sort of unconscious axiomatic sense. The first time that you get that sort of insight is the bridge into the integral teal phase. So the unique dynamic that comes online with integral consciousness is it sees hierarchy and systems of systems, that it's not simply pluralism and equality, everything is equal to everything else, but wait a minute, some things work better than others. Some systems of knowledge, some religious systems even, some societies, all of these things work better than others when put into practice over the course of human history. And so the integral perspective holds multiple perspectives at the same time. It deals in paradox. It is flexible and creative. It's the leading edge of consciousness and of culture. And there's something that Ken Wilber calls the pre-trans fallacy when it comes to integral thinking, and I'll do my best to briefly explain it, which is essentially you have someone who is in the modernist and the postmodern frame of mind. They see things like God, like religion often, and think this is pre-rational, like this is just silly. This doesn't make sense. And then the integral person comes online and sees maybe sort of like Jung, where this is the great soil from which all of the archetypes emerge for their culture. We can't just leave all of this behind, all the religion and the spirituality. And there is so much good to be had here. And so we're willing to take it as if it were true. And maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but we're willing to engage in religious thinking and ideas. And the modernists and the postmodernists see both of these things, the true dogmatist of the lower level religious thinker and the integral sort of flexible engaging in archetypes, all of these sorts of things. They see both of those ways of interacting, and they see the common theme, which is spirituality or religion, and it's immediately cast aside. Like, ooh, no, these are the same thing. You guys are doing the same thing. This is gross. This is unacceptable. You guys are pre-rational. Well, in fact, the integral phase is post-rational. It sees the limits of rationality itself as an explanatory and a validating system of knowledge and explanations. So, and then above the teal integral, which I guess you could call the individual integral, sort of individualistically integrating, then you have the turquoise integral, which is the community integrator, which is seeing things holistically, cosmocentric, lives for both the individual self and the transpersonal self. This is just emerging, according to Ken Wilber and his followers, in terms of how many people exhibit these sort of behaviors. And then beyond this, we have the post-integral sort of oneness, the being one with all things. This is the great sages of human history. This is the Buddha. This is Christ. This is all of the people that you would consider prophets and wise ones. At least that's sort of a way of conceptualizing it. So anyways, there's my diversion about Ken Wilber. And to get back to the essay, so now let's think of another multi-level as if it were sort of entity. Certainly God is an as if it were entity, that one can have an as if it were relationship with God stretching all the way down to the animistic notions associated with lower developmental stages of consciousness, and all the way up to the higher, more integrated stages of conscious development. First, we have the spirit in all animate life, then the God who dwells in heaven, then the corporeal God in Christ, then the God archetype who acts as an invisible hand in the realm of ideas. And then there is whatever is beyond this, something difficult to describe, the as if it were of God that bridges the postmodern divide into the nested hierarchies of higher and integral consciousness. This is how the God image functions as if it were real. even if it might not be literally true. An example of how the God image functions at a lower level is how the aliveness, quote-unquote, of living creatures seems to pass on to somewhere else. The Greek pneuma or psyche, the Latin spiritus or animus, the breath that is suddenly no longer there. The idea of God's acts in this sort of shepherd and steward of the breath, the original one who draws breath and thus breathed breath into those who breathe. The God is in all things that live, in the ultimately self-evident phenomenal reality. The inanimate and animate divide, the breathing and the breathless divide, which is even reflected in many linguistic noun declension systems. For example, the original gender for Proto-Indo-European nouns, before they were given sexed distinctions, masculine, feminine, or neuter, it was animate and inanimate. As the person or community moves up in the hierarchy of consciousness development, the God image now functions as the judge who decrees the gradations of correctness preserved in a code of law. God is now more than simply what is and what is alive, but also what could be, and even what should be. The question of what is right versus what is wrong appears to arise out of the animistic what is alive versus what is dead, what promotes life and what induces death. And then from these conceits of right and wrong within life in the group, one can further extrapolate out what is right and wrong between groups. I think that the idea of right and wrong probably originates with the family as a social unit, along with the role that a person holds within the family at a given time. Then, the moral gaze emerges out of the family unit as this sort of merged whole and turns toward the individual as within, but psychically distinct from the family. Then the moral eye turns to the family and the individual as member of the broader community, then toward the abstracted moral axioms of their community as ideals which can be compared to a broader sphere of communities across space and time. From these reified ideals, hypotheticals can now emerge, like, what is the binding ethic within my community that exists between communities? What is love, justice, etc.? In other words, as language reflects upon itself in the form of grammar and psychosocial reflexivity, you get the first forms of philosophy. You then start to approach the postmodern dilemma, which is essentially that once you realize that the natural tendency of any community to self-reinforce its own value structure, it calls into question the reality of objective morality or any universal system of valuation. In other words, postmodernism rejects any morality or value system which claims to exist outside of a specific context, be it a sort of ultimate Platonic realm of ideas in nature as a reified abstraction of natural processes, or in the social consensus of law, order, and the status quo. How then can we ever actually say, as an outside observer, or as an inside observer for that matter, which community is ultimately right or wrong? How can we say that one moral code is better than another when we cannot even say what better or worse are without appealing to pre-existing moral orders? Every community has its own moral order, along with an incumbent contextual framework from which that value system arose and perpetuates. How can we say that our values are better than another's without arbitrarily superimposing one's cultural values onto another? This results in the breakdown of God as a unifying image, since any one God must be simply a product of the culture from which it arose, and therefore not generalizable across cultures without smuggling in implicit assumptions in a form of cultural colonialism. This is the trouble with postmodernity, for if taken to its logical conclusion, it makes the process of evaluation next to impossible. Why is this a problem? Because in the ascent through the developmental stages of consciousness, one is typically only able to see the quote-unquote obvious truths of one's own developmental stage, and in that forget the inherent necessity of the interpretive frameworks which preceded how one currently thinks. The postmodern mind is indeed at a higher stage of consciousness development than the legalistic, than the animistic, than the scriptural literalist, etc. Those individuals and communities of which they are a part, and thus postmodern relativism is a necessary stage which must be passed through in the ascent toward integration. However, those who live in that frame of reference still have not reached a level of conscious development sufficient to reflect backwards and see each prior stage was necessary to reach where they are now. It reminds me of Plato in Plato's Republic, talking about how he loves the poets. They were so important for him to reach the philosophical insights that he says. But then in his ideal society, we're going to ban all the poets. It will only be state-run poetry, essentially. Because to him, it's like, well, they just need to be dropped. These people need to be dropped in to where I already am. And not understanding that there is a ladder. There's a sort of progression in terms of the kinds of media and art that people consume, but also the way in which they engage with religiosity. And that a lot of people are going to get stuck at the lower stages than which they are. And that's just the nature of the beast. But that doesn't mean that you take out those bottom rungs of the ladder and then act confused when people are looking for them and they're not able to engage with you where you are as a sort of quote-unquote higher thinker. And this is a very common temptation for people who, sort of get into the world of ideas, or especially in postmodern academia. I see this a lot. This is the sort of ivory tower notion, like, kind of get on my level, bro. Why don't you already think like I do? That's in part because people need each stage along the ladder up in order to get to something higher than, like we said, animism, scriptural literalism, rational hyperfocus, postmodernism, all these things. They're all rungs on the ladder. So the postmodern stage 6 individual or community is also unable to see gradations in capacity between themselves and others. They, like all non-integral conscious thinkers, simply assume that those around them already are, or quote-unquote should be, like them. California acts as a political manifestation for this tendency, for those in the postmodern stage of development to impose preposterously out-of-touch edicts which have disastrous results for the broad majority of people who live in the law and order phase or lower in consciousness development. It always is and has to be a gradual process for anyone to ascend the hierarchy of conscious development. No steps can be skipped. There is no ex nihilo inception of consciousness, morality, or value, especially the great capital V values of love, beauty, justice, goodness, etc. These highly salient aspects of life all have a sort of grass-rootedness about them that arises with time and experience, and even though it is difficult to put into words, that does not make it any less real as a process. In fact, it appears to me that time is the process of evaluation, or at the very least, it is from experiencing in time that things can be evaluated. Nothing can be evaluated in absence of time, and everything shows its value through its playing out across time. This touches on what I think may be the solution to the postmodern dilemma of an inability to value things, which is to simply give things time. The problem with that is that simply being given time without what might be called the right guidance, quote-unquote, will likely result in consciousness at the level of the society and the individual regressing backward down the hierarchy. More significantly, this quote-unquote guidance must continually be context-informed, moral and religious in nature, I believe, and provide an Ariadne's thread through all the ascending and descending modes of consciousness. People, it seems, tend to go backwards in their conscious mode without the exertion of effort. Backwards is the easy route. I'm not saying this is universally true, as there is something to be said for the fact that once you see the shadows on the cave's wall, referring to Plato's allegory, you can never really go back. It's more just to say that there does appear to be a sort of psychic entropy that acts upon us, both individuals and as societies. What then about the God image ties together all of the separate but necessary stages along this path of conscious development? Moral valuation, the ability to cooperate, self-reflexivity, and critique, all of the things that come with higher levels of consciousness. Somehow the God image ties them all together into one discrete idea and allows them to transcend each phase-relevant barrier without losing sight of the transcendent as a unity. The as if it were of the God image is particularly important at stage 6, the very stage when most conscious entities, individuals or communities, reject the notion of God, which is the postmodern evaporation of objective morality and meta-narratives. The way in which I think this happens is, yes, a rejection of what may be called biblical literalism, but also an acceptance and a growing understanding of the as if it were of God. It's not as if it were God, it's the as if it were of God, with as if it were describing a discrete qualia or idea which can be described, but perhaps not measured in the same way that temperature can be measured with a thermometer. The as if it were nature of God, or the metaphorical practice of accepting that God as if he were real, allows the rational aspects of the postmodern condition to bridge the gap into integral consciousness without completely losing itself in relativism, thus avoiding the pitfalls inherent in the breakdown of a clear moral and evaluative order. The as if it were element of God allows people caught in the postmodern dilemma to reconcile the clearly false and simplistic aspects of common religious belief with the need to continue believing in something transcendent in order for themselves and for their communities to progress and resist entropy. The as if it were of God allows for rationalism to have its cake of the death of God, quote unquote, while still allowing for the epistemic humility that spiritualism demands. This is because the image of God functions as if it were true to the point that it is as if it were factually true when lived out with sincerity. The God image is thus so much more than simply a metaphor in the traditional sense of the word, i.e., figure of speech only. And that is the end of part 2 of my essay series on the as if it were. Next time we talk, we're going to go through part 3 of this essay series I wrote about the as if it were. And we're going to get in deep with the topics of free will, agency. Is it a fantasy? Is it an illusion? We'll talk about Robert Sapolsky. And if I'm not mistaken in this essay, we also will talk about Hans Weichinger and his theory of as if, which is very interesting. And I think that we pass him up way too easily as a great philosopher of the 19th and I think early 20th century. Yeah, I'm pretty sure Philosophy is As If was written in the early 1900s or published then. So anyways, thank you for joining me. My name is Jake, and this is the Polysophical Society. Until next time.